courage. But in the brutal shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little. Only fresh success mattered, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had shattered a kingdom would soon see how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. And Boleyn's enemies didn't attack her with armies or swords. They came with whispers, secrets, and carefully sharpened lies. In the back rooms of court, betrayal was brewing. Silent, patient, deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their alliance had been built on mutual ambition, but now their interests clashed. Anne wanted reforms to help the poor and limit the power of greedy nobles. Cromwell wanted stability, favor with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous.
And in
Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into irritation, suspicion, and cold detachment. And had few true friends left. Even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight. The perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. It was Cromwell who moved first, knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted an exit, but lacked a convenient excuse. Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed, not by divorce, which would humiliate Henry, but by disgrace? The accusations were wild, monstrous, even adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. And the proud, brilliant queen, painted as a betrayer, a temptress, a threat to the very crown she once redefined. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, coaxing confessions under torture, twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges made little sense. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king needed it to be. And, sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared, but it was no use. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to meet her eyes. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great gate slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate. And now alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. And Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the woman who had once changed the destiny of England. The charges against her were shocking. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, high treason, conspiracy against the king. In another world, such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. But here, now they were simply theater, a grim performance designed to give Henry VII exactly what he wanted. Anne's downfall wrapped in a thin veil of legality, and defended herself with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided long before and set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning words. Dates and places contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy when it existed at all. But the truth was irrelevant now, and was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well, and would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read and did not break, she stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke, clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm had been brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. But even then they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. Yet even facing the end, Anne refused to crumble. In the cold, echoing halls of the tower, Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, wept in private, and comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was finalized, Henry was arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this final betrayal from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her must have been the deepest cut. On May 18, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy bought, perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed carefully for her final moment. A dark gray gown of damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirt beneath, colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, and Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her gray gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. In those final moments, Anne offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage stunned even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward and knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in an arrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. A queen once crowned in gold now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen whose reign would see the flowering of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. And Berlin changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality. Not through her survival, but through her indelible impact on history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered like a pot left too long over a roaring fire. The relationship with Britain, once seen as the proud mother country, had soured into resentment, suspicion, and growing fury. It hadn't started with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by placing taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That was followed by the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law passed thousands of miles away by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation was like another spark landing in dry brush. At first, the anger showed itself in polite petitions and fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with passionate arguments about liberty and rights. But as time wore on, frustration deepened into something darker. A slow realization that Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain didn't care. Many colonists clung to the hope that if they just made enough noise, if they just reasoned hard enough, Parliament would repeal the taxes, and sometimes they did. The Stamp Act was famously repealed after loud colonial protest. But every small victory was followed by new legislation, new taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It never really was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What infuriated the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than citizens, ruled like distant possessions rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the edge. A final insult would tip them into open defiance, and it came not in the form of soldiers or new laws or armies, but in the quiet, seemingly harmless shape of crates stacked with tea. The colonists didn't know it yet, but the night that tea floated in the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the world would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made a critical miscalculation. Believing the American colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea, they passed the Tea Act, a law that was supposed to save the struggling British East India Company and incidentally reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it looked like a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, slashing prices, and offering a luxury product at a bargain, a few pennies cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price of tea, it was the principle behind it. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea firmly in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkable. A surrender of the liberties they had fought to protect for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was especially fierce. Already a city scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship, Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings swelled. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or drunk on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial tea were turned away by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear: we will not be bought. But in Boston, fate twisted differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Ella, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the harbor, and sat there, refusing to leave. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A deadlock grew, taut as a drawn bowstring. The tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same again. As the British tea ship sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbor, the city itself transformed into a powder keg. Every day that passed without resolution tightened the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting. It was preparing for a fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved swiftly to organize resistance. They posted public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea and held raucous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants alike. Each gathering added fuel to the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the resistance. Thousands crammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed, speeches were made, and tempers boiled. Each vote against the unloading of tea was another hammer blow against British authority. But while the people of Boston stood united, the clock was ticking. British law demanded that imported goods like tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, demanding that the law be obeyed. Colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp sense before a storm when the world holds its breath. All it would take was one spark to ignite an explosion. And somewhere among the crowded streets and crowded hearts of Boston, a decision was quietly taking shape. A plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16, 1773 dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline had arrived. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials could seize the cargo and British troops could be called in to enforce the law. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once, their cause, their claim to rights and liberty would unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked miles through the icy countryside to be there. The meeting was so packed that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of rebellion, presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against tyranny, to urge immediate action. But even among the defiants, uncertainty hung heavy. What could be done without sparking outright war? How could they stop the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, the king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder with the force of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple sentence. But everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be taken. Outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom. The signal. Men disguised themselves quickly, smearing soot on their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message no one could mistake. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer, not with words, but with defiance. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows. Ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot, some adorned with feathers. They weren't trying to fool anyone into believing they were real Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding their old identities, of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By the dozens, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbor water churned cold and dark beneath them, thick with the sharp bite of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was not a riot. It was a mission carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. No harm came to the sailors. They were pushed aside, watched in silence as the operation began. Men split open the wooden chests with practiced blows, the fragrant smell of fresh tea spilling into the cold night air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still waters of the harbor. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and dumped until the black water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf. Silent, Ed. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains unclear. Some accounts suggest that even among British loyalists, there was an understanding. Something had shifted, and there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen. No one raided the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was targeted. In a town where hunger and hardship were daily realities, the men could have easily turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it was over, the harbor resembled a great swirling cauldron filled with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The smell of the sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the night air with a strange bittersweet scent. The work was done. Silently, the men disappeared into the night, vanishing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, an act of cold, deliberate defiance carried out under the cloak of night. The harbor was transformed into a giant swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in great mats on the water, staining it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be chastised by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle pure and simple. The town woke the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread like wildfire. Word of mouth, letters, broadsheets. By midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened. And opinions split fast. Among patriots there was pride, a fierce, swelling pride, that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. To them, the destruction of property was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, furious not only at the destruction, but at the message it sent. If the king's authority could be defied so brazenly in Boston, where else might rebellion spark? British officials were stunned. They had expected protests, boycotts, maybe another riot like those that had broken out over the Stamp Act. They hadn't expected organized, disciplined revolutionaries to calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without so much as breaking a window. The ship's captains, the Dartmouth, the Elenina, the Beaver, could only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared beneath the waves. In the official ledgers, the night's loss would be tallied at over £10,000 British pounds, a fortune. But the real loss wasn't measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface. A shared, undeniable truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending. A reckoning was coming and Boston was ready. When word of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was swift and furious. To British officials, it was not simply a protest. It was rebellion, an open, mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. King George III, upon hearing the news, was said to have grown cold with anger. Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial disobedience, exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment not just for the city of Boston but as a warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of laws so harsh they were quickly nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came swiftly: the Boston Port Act. In one brutal stroke, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbor, the economic lifeline of the city, until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored. Ships could no longer enter or leave. Trade vanished. Goods and supplies dried up. Boston, once vibrant and noisy, grew quiet, its docks eerily still. But the punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-governing rights, placing it firmly under the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain. A clear message that British authorities were untouchable. And to make sure the colony's new force was an option, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the very citizens they were meant to subdue. The message was clear: rebellion would be crushed. Liberty was a luxury the crown would no longer tolerate. But Parliament's heavy hand had an unintended effect. Instead of frightening the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. News of Boston's suffering, of its port closed, its people starving under martial law, stirred deep sympathy and righteous anger throughout America. Wagon loads of food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, pledges of unity, and secret meetings began to weave the once fragmented colonies closer together. What had once been a Massachusetts problem was rapidly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example of them. Instead, they made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The flames of revolution, once flickering in isolated pockets, now began to blaze from colony to colony, and there would be no easy extinguishing them. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond the rocky shores of Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage turned into something far more dangerous for Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, bickering and competing, separated by geography, religion, and trade rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, Americans across the continent realized if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response was swift. Colonists sent wagons full of food, supplies, and letters of solidarity to the suffering people of Boston. Town meetings buzzed with anger. Newspaper printers worked day and night to spread the news. The fight was no longer Boston's alone. It was everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to discuss a unified response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once merely regional figures, now stood together as architects of a movement that was growing larger by the day. Their goal, at least officially, was not yet full independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the old relationship of mutual respect under the British Crown, but beneath the polite debates and carefully worded petitions, a deeper understanding was taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand separately. At the Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods. They pledged mutual support in the face of further British aggression. And they made it clear any attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses across the continent, ordinary people began using words that had once been whispered only in private. Unity, resistance, liberty. In bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had imagined it would crush rebellion. Instead, it had welded the colonies together into something far more dangerous. A people who, despite their differences, were beginning to think of themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer just stirring. They were gathering into a storm, and it was too late for Britain to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just crates that were destroyed. It was the illusion that the American colonies could remain loyal subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark that no king, no army, no distant parliament could ever snuff out. In the months that followed, that spark caught fire across the colonies. What had once been protests, boycotts, and polite petitions hardened into open resistance. Town militias began drilling openly, storehouses filled with powder and shot. Men who had once toasted King George III in taverns now whispered about revolution under the same roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbowed. The more Britain tried to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship that sailed past the closed, silent harbor of Boston was a silent reminder that tyranny had met its match in American defiance. When Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, they intended to make an example out of Boston to scare the other colonies into submission. Instead, they had created a martyr city, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists realized that their fates were tied together. Resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, freedom. By the spring of 1775, the tension reached a boiling point outside Boston. In the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to confiscate colonial weapons instead found armed farmers, ordinary men ready to defend their rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, a direct line traced back to the moment when men chose principle over profit and dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed the world that revolution doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it starts quietly, with a small group of determined people, standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting attacks. They were rejecting an empire. And though the road ahead would be bloody, bitter, and uncertain, one thing had become clear that night in Boston Harbor. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. All before the towering pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamian cities buzzed with life, before Stonehenge stood against the sky, there was Corral. Hidden away in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, Corral rose in silent majesty nearly 5,000 years ago, then faded into near-complete oblivion, swallowed by sands and forgotten by history. For centuries, the world did not even know it existed. The Super Valley, where Carroll once thrived, seems at first glance an unlikely place for civilization to bloom. The landscape is parched, barren, the river little more than a thin silver thread winding through rocks and dust. To most eyes, it looked inhospitable, a place abandoned by life. Yet it was here, amid the desolation, that one of humanity's earliest great cities took shape. Corral wasn't just a collection of scattered huts or a temporary trading post. It was a planned city sprawling over 150 acres filled with pyramids, plazas, residential quarters, and ceremonial spaces. It had scale, purpose, and vision. A complex society blossoming centuries before the Egyptians began stacking stones into pyramids of their own. The people of Cairo achieved this without the wheel, without written language, without metal tools. They built massive structures from stone and earth with nothing but ingenuity, communal effort, and the raw power of human will. Yet for thousands of years, Cairo's existence remained a secret. Even when travelers stumbled across the strange weathered mounds scattered across the valley, they mistook them for natural formations, mere hills sculpted by the desert winds. No one imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities in the world, predating even the civilizations that history books had crowned as the firsts. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists led by Ruth Shady uncovered the truth. What they found buried in the dust of time would rewrite the story of the Americas and force the world to reconsider what it thought it knew about the birth of civilization itself. Cairo had risen, flourished, and fallen in total anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones are speaking again, whispering of a peaceful, intelligent people who built a world of complexity and wonder in a land where life itself seemed impossible. And this was only the beginning of their story. At first glance, the Sup Valley looks like a place where life should struggle to exist. Harsh winds sweep across endless stretches of sand and stone. The sun beats down mercilessly, drying out the earth, baking the landscape into cracked, brittle sheets. Water is scarce, the river a meandering thread, fighting for survival. To the untrained eye, it is a wasteland, barren, empty, forgotten by the gods. But the people of Corral saw something different. They did not see a desert to be feared. They saw a canvas to be shaped. They recognized the river, however modest, as the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with patience, ingenuity, and sheer determination, they turned this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of life and culture. Their first victory was agriculture. They learned to tame the river's seasonal floods, building simple, but brilliant irrigation systems that channeled water across the valley floor. Where others saw sand and dust, they coaxed green shoots of hope. Cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became their treasure. It was spun into fishing nets and textiles, fueling trade with coastal villages and creating bonds that stretched far beyond their desert home. But growing crops was only part of their mastery. The people of Corral understood that survival in the desert required balance. They worked with nature, not against it. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth designed to withstand both scorching heat and the rare, punishing rains that occasionally swept through the valley. They studied the stars and seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the veins and arteries of Corral's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade goods flowed up and down the coast. In exchange, Cairo received exotic goods. Colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, ideas from distant peoples. They were not isolated. They were connected. In a land where survival seemed impossible, Cairo thrived through intelligence, innovation, and community. They didn't conquer the desert with brute force. They partnered with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, building a society that was not just functional. It was extraordinary. Against the odds, Cairo blossomed into a beacon of civilization, and it was only beginning to rise, rising out of the desert like ancient guardians. The pyramids of Corral defy everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These were not small, crude structures built by primitive hands. They were massive, deliberate works of architecture created by a people with vision, organization, and ambition. The centerpiece of the city was the Pyramid Mare, the largest of Corral's monumental structures. It stretched more than 450 feet in length and towered nearly 60 feet above the desert floor. A feat of engineering on par with the early wonders of the ancient world. Built from stone, mud, and woven reed bags filled with rocks, the pyramid was designed not just to endure the harsh climate, but to withstand the punishing earthquakes that occasionally rattled the region. And endure it did, standing silent against wind and time for nearly 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Cairo were not tombs. Unlike the massive burial complexes of Egypt, Cairo's pyramids served a different purpose. They were centers of ceremony, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces crowned their summits, accessible by broad, elegant staircases. Fires once burned atop these platforms, and rituals were held beneath the endless Peruvian sky. At the foot of the pyramids, vast plazas opened up, sunken and circular, inviting thousands to gather for religious ceremonies, political meetings, and communal celebrations. The very design of Cairo's cityscape suggested a society that prized community and order, a people deeply connected to one another and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes fanned out, likely home to priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids themselves seem to have been strategically placed, aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, the cycles of the stars. To the people of Cairo, architecture wasn't just practical. It was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Walking among the weathered stones today, it's almost impossible not to feel a strange sense of awe. These structures were raised without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Yet, they rose with symmetry, scale, and staggering precision. The Great Pyramids of Cairo were not built for vanity, nor for war. They were built to connect earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity. And they still whisper across the sands, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Among the ruins of Cairo, there is something profoundly different, something that sets it apart from so many ancient civilizations. No weapons have been found buried beneath its sands. No defensive walls circle its plazas. No mass graves hint at bloody conquest or internal strife. Unlike the kingdoms that rose and fell through war, Cairo was a society built on peace. It's a revelation that defies expectations. Here was a civilization that flourished not through violence, but through cooperation, trade, and shared belief. The people of Cairo seem to have invested their energy not in armies or fortresses, but in architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their plazas and pyramids weren't monuments to victory over enemies. They were centers of celebration, worship, and governance. This was a civilization that chose to gather rather than conquer, to negotiate rather than destroy. Trade was the lifeblood of Cairo's success. Cotton grown along the fertile riverbanks was spun into fishing nets that were traded with coastal communities. In return, Cairo received dried fish, an essential source of protein, and exotic goods from faraway places. Colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, and even rare tropical fruits from distant valleys. This wide network of trade stitched the region together, binding far-flung communities into a peaceful web of mutual benefit, and in the center of it all, Cairo thrived as a cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life played a vital role in maintaining social harmony. The city's grand public spaces and sunken plazas likely served as stages for rituals that united the people under shared spiritual beliefs. Music filled these gatherings. Flutes carved from condor bones, drums made from deer hides, creating soundscapes that echoed across the desert, tying individual lives to something greater. Leadership, too, appeared to rely less on military strength and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. The city's leaders must have coordinated massive construction projects, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complex trade agreements, all without leaving behind the brutal scars of war. In an ancient world so often defined by conflict, Cairo stands as a shining exception, a reminder that civilization does not have to rise on the broken backs of the conquered. It can instead be built by the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. At Cairo, the stones still seemed to hum with echoes of a world long gone. It was not just a city of buildings and trade. It was a city alive with sound, ceremony, and spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were woven into the very heartbeat of Carroll civilization. Archaeologists digging carefully through the dry sands uncovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes crafted from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles fashioned from deer antlers, small drums stretched with animal hides. These artifacts were not simple toys. They were crafted with care, tuned to specific notes designed to carry sound across the wide open plazas of the city. In a world without written language, music spoke the language of the soul. Imagine it, the low thrum of drums rising at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, feet stamping on the sunken plazas as hundreds gathered under the fading light. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms. Priests dressed in intricate woven garments would chant to the gods of the river, the earth, the stars. In those moments, Carroll was not just a city. It was a symphony. The layout of Corral itself suggests that ritual life was at its core. The grand plazas were not mere open spaces. They were stages for communal ceremonies, carefully designed to draw people together. The sunken circular courts acted like ancient amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the rituals performed at their centers. And above them all, the pyramids loomed. Not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built by human hands, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals likely marked the turning of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the movements of the stars. Music was not just entertainment. It was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine, between the known and the mysteries beyond. No violent murals, no terrifying gods of war, no bloodthirsty sacrifices. In Corral, the spiritual world seems to have been one of harmony, celebration, and reverence. Even today, when the desert wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear it. The faint strains of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, meaning, and connection in the heart of the harsh, endless sands. Carroll wasn't just a place of music, trade, and ritual. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, the people of Carroll shaped a city of stone and earth that has endured nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements were astonishing. Massive pyramids rose from the desert floor, constructed not with small, fragile bricks, but with enormous stones carried across the dry valley. Workers transported rocks using reed bags, ingenious baskets strong enough to bear heavy loads woven from the very plants that grew along the river banks. Layer upon layer they built with care, stacking stone and filling the interiors with rubble to create structures that could withstand not only time but nature's fury. And they understood nature well. Corral lies in a region prone to violent earthquakes. Yet their pyramids and plazas survived largely intact. How? By mastering earthquake-resistant architecture. Builders used flexible construction techniques, layered fills, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. It was engineering born not from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the earth itself. Water management was another silent triumph. Despite living in a desert, the people of Carroll developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Channels and canals carefully guided river water to their agricultural fields, allowing crops to flourish even during dry seasons. No water was wasted. Every drop mattered. The layout of Corral itself reflected brilliant urban planning. Major structures aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep understanding of the solar cycles. The sunken plazas, with their precise geometry, were more than gathering places. They were instruments for tracking the heavens, allowing priests and astronomers to predict seasons crucial for survival. Even the city's organization spoke of a complex society. Residential zones, administrative areas, ceremonial centers, all were arranged in harmony, balancing communal life with sacred spaces. They built not just for the moment, but for generations. Today, as modern engineers marvel at Corral's resilience, they are reminded that greatness is not measured by technology alone. Sometimes the deepest wisdom lies in understanding the forces of nature, in working with the land, not against it. Corral stones have endured storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent testament to a civilization that engineered their dreams into the desert sands. For centuries, the city of Cairo flourished, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. And then, quietly, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fires marked its fall. No signs of conquest scar its walls. No mass graves or shattered monuments tell a story of sudden disaster. Instead, Corral simply faded. Its plazas emptied. Its pyramids left to the drifting sands. Its flutes and drums silenced by time. Why did they leave? That question still lingers like a ghost across the Super Valley. Some scholars believe that environmental change struck the final blow. Evidence suggests that a long period of drought may have crippled Corral's agriculture. Without the river's life-giving waters, the fields would have withered. Trade networks dependent on surplus cotton and food would have faltered. The careful balance Corral had maintained with its harsh environment may have finally tipped beyond repair. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new centers of power emerged along the coast and inland, Carroll's influence might have diminished. Perhaps the goods they once supplied, cotton, fish, produce, were no longer enough to sustain their role as a dominant city. Slowly the lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious upheaval, or simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual, not sudden. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys, stronger rivers, new beginnings. Children who once ran across Corral's plazas grew up telling stories of a lost city behind them, stories that would eventually fade into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. Winds carried fine sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands, waiting. Today, as archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the question still burns. How does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, simply vanish? Perhaps the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful, are still fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, forever vulnerable to the unseen forces of change. For millennia, Carroll lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Super Valley. Travelers passed the strange rounded hills that dotted the landscape, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were just natural formations, mounds shaped by the wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Carroll's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that these hills might hold secrets no one had yet uncovered. What they found would rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids, a city far older than anyone could have imagined. Radioarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Corral was over 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Carroll, scholars believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later, shadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral changed everything. It proved that the Americas had birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social organization independently long before the rise of the Incas, or the Mayor Ruth Shady and her team found not just stone and rubble, but the remnants of life, musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, ancient knot records, and even offerings made to the gods. Each artifact told a story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. Carroll's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood revealed under the open sky once more. Its plazas kissed by the same winds that had once carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Carroll is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to see, to remember. Carroll stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that civilization's roots stretch far deeper than we once believed. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey. A story not of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the stars without written records. They created a thriving society rooted in trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of war upon the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision of what civilization can be. A society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence. That greatness is not measured by how many armies march across a battlefield, but by how a community comes together to build, to create, to dream. Carroll's legacy reaches far beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges old assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban life and monumental architecture belonged first to the Old World. Carroll proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands, but driven by the same eternal desires to endure, to celebrate, to reach toward the divine. Today, walking among Corral's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it. The pulse of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining in the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories are still with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Carroll teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping under sands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history, Corral shines not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.